Hi, welcome to Healthy Alternatives, where we explore complementary and alternative health care modalities, as well as other lifestyle choices that promote and enhance human health. Tonight's guest is a returning guest. We had him on last year, Dr. Michael Kane, who is a doctor of naturopathy. Is it naturopathy? How do you say it?
Yes, you can say naturopathy.
Doctor of naturopathy, and your practice is in?
We have an office in Middletown and in West Hartford.
West Hartford.
Yep.
So it's good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me
Looking
back.
well?
Yeah, doing good.
Good, you look great.
Happy spring is on.
Well, maybe. I don't know. You know, they'll be controlling the weather next. Maybe they are, and which kind of brings us to tonight's topic is genetically modified foods,
Yes.
more commonly known as GMOs.
Yep.
And really how we have been exposed to these foods for quite some time now, Dr. Kane. What would you say, about 10, 15 years they've been on our grocery shelves?
Yeah, they've been, kind of expanding their use.
Their repertoire of the things.
But it is truly one of the kind of most nightmarish experiments on the human population to date, I think.
Well, because it's an unknown experiment. Most people are totally unaware that they're consuming these products.
Yep.
And there are health ramifications, which you are seeing in your practice.
Yep.
With people coming in with various things. They don't know what's wrong with them, and, nobody seems to know what's going on. The whole GMO idea, of course, people defend the use of these products for food supply, and it's, we're trying to feed a global population and the economics of farming.
Sure. So all those things, get talked about. When we talk about just, providing food for an expanding human population, and, there's, the big solutions, and there's the ones that are more sustainable, and we could talk about that.
Sure.
But I think, probably starting with just defining what we're talking about when we say genetically modified, is probably a good place to start.
Sure.
Just from the term, we know that genetics kind of make up, every living organism. And
so it's our DNA and
yes,
RNA
exactly. So
really
it makes
our fundamental starting point.
So we know that there's a roadmap that every organism has to kind of reproduce itself. So that is what is at the center of what we're talking about. And in the past, when you study biology, you study Mendel, and the peas.
Oh, right. And everybody thinks that was so great. He did all that,
Right.
Increasing yields and...
Right. So he, basically tried to kind of see what effect we can have on, the production of things by introducing, crossbreeding or different traits that can be expressed in a plant.
Exactly, and we just think about our dogs and cats,
right?
Right? How we get different breeds and characteristics.
So, in the process of just natural selection, what we see over the time is that we've evolved a diversity on this planet of array of different animals and plant species, and that's from a natural progression of genetic kind of swapping.
Sort of a natural way of things getting together.
Right.
And the environment will impact that particular thing, and then the thing that's most likely to survive
gets reinforced.
Right.
So when we talk about, the genetic modification, we're talking about enforcing, man's kind of process.
Well, tinkering.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm.
With
beyond Mendel's wildest dreams.
Beyond Mendel. So we're talking about taking genes from very diverse species that would never happen in nature and combining them in the hopes that something will kind of spring more kind of prosperous in the yield or resistant to pests or other things.
Right.
So the idea that we could do that in a laboratory and then kind of promote this kind of is kind of like, an interesting sci-fi movie.
Well, it is kind of an interesting idea, and, there could even be merit to it if the long-term effects of that tinkering were really investigated.
And that's certainly the issue. Being, someone who lives in, one of the most prosperous countries in the world, you would think that any company should have to do their homework before they kind of do something that has ramifications on a nation's health.
Exactly. And, the more I was reading about GMOs and have been reading about it, it's totally shocking that this is not regulated at all.
No. And this...
At all. I mean, we have regulations about everything. And something as important as human health and actually our food supply is just, whatever they wanted to do, they're able to do.
So, in the best of all worlds, you would think that, if you're proposing something that is going to kind of genetically change a species or a plant, in this case, that you would have to prove that long-term effects are significant.
Yeah, and by long-term, we're not talking like a 6-month study here.
No, we're talking decades.
Exactly, and these corporations, say the economic incentives then are not as great, but these are multi-billion-dollar corporations that are doing this work.
Sure.
So
So the requirements that were kind of not placed on this to have to go into production were astoundingly missing.
It's missing. And
yes.
as a matter, and unfortunately, the United States is not doing it, really not taking the lead on this. Some European countries are. I know Germany has banned certain foods.
I mean,
even India. Now imagine that. You have a country where people are, some people are still starving there, and they're like, look, we don't want this food in our soil.
So the preliminary stuff that they did do, and when I say they, we're talking about, Monsanto.
It's really Monsanto, and who's the other? There's another one.
There's 3 basic ones. Monsanto's
That's
primary.
The big one.
Yeah.
Right.
But they basically did...
Syngestas.
Yes, Syngenta
and Bayer.
I don't know about Bayer, but I know Syngenta
around with rice. I'm not really sure. But really, at least as far as tonight's conversation, Monsanto has done enough damage to get the point across to our viewers.
So basically what they did do is they compared the nutritional profile of the genetically modified to the regular plant.
Mother Nature.
And found, it's got similar carbohydrate, protein, and fats. It's got to be fine. But, if you take that analogy to something we're probably familiar with in the health kind of field and say, well, let's look at mad cow disease. And we compare the protein from a cow that has mad cow to a protein of a cow that's healthy. They're going to be exactly the same.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you want to go out and eat the cow that's, kind of got the infection.
Right.
So to do that type of research and to say it's gotten the stamp of approval and it's safe is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. And, if you kind of go back a little bit in the history of the GMOs, at first I know with Monsanto, they produced a crop that would be resistant to herbicide.
Correct.
Glyphosate is the name of the herbicide. So essentially they make this seed, grows up to be a plant, and they can spray all this glyphosate all over the crops, and it will kill everything but the crop. And unfortunately, you've got glyphosate residues not only in the plant but in the groundwater now, and the water.
Right.
Some watersheds in certain states are ridiculously high levels of that. But then it kind of even progressed into a more diabolical mad scientist kind of scenario where they've actually tinkered with the gene strain even more so that it's resistant to a certain type of pest, which is, in the case of corn, a corn borer, right?
Right.
And the plant actually makes its own pesticide.
Right. So it
makes its own toxin to kill this corn borer. So that's where we kind of are now.
Right.
So the glyphosate thing, that's like, that's the least of our problems, really.
Well, I mean, and when, I think 60 Minutes did a profile on farmers who kind of bought into this.
Well, a lot of times, you know, they're feeding the family type.
No.
Yeah, local farmers.
For whatever reason, you know. And the effects on their land, their farm, have been significant because what they found was when they used, you know, the genetically modified crops, what happened is that the weed population got resistant to the herbicides.
Oh, well, that's probably why they said, well, make a corn that makes its own.
Right. So, I mean, so they had to use more
of the glyphosate.
And then, you know, some of these farmers said, you know, my land is now
barren.
Right.
Except for corn.
So, you know, they're then have altered the
soil,
you know, the soil,
the whole ecosystem of soil, which is all.
So, you know, just that toxicity effect is one thing, but when you talk about modification genetically, you know, it's one thing to, you know, apply pesticides, you know, and you know, we know over time that eventually, you know, the pesticide residue will decrease. And
if you stop using it.
Right. And it, you know, can regain some of its, you know, kind of health back. But once you introduce a genetic modification, there's no going back.
To that particular strain of plant.
Right. And the problem is, and initially they said there's no way that that genetic information that's been altered in that plant can, you know, jump to the host species or other things. But
essentially, right. So in other words, what you're trying to say, Dr. Kane, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's no way that if a human being eats a genetically modified food, that the human's DNA won't be altered.
Right. So that was their,
but they never did any studies to prove that.
No. But some of the studies subsequent has found that the genetically modified proteins have gotten into our intestinal bacteria that have then gotten into our cell structures. So it's having an effect, you know.
It is having an effect on us.
Yes, on our genes and our expression of genes. So one of the things that, you know, we know in studying the genetic makeup is that it's not only what our DNA is. We have almost an envelope over our DNA that is called the epigenome. And there are things that can turn on or turn off your genes and have an expression on your overall health picture.
So in other words, we have our DNA.
Yep.
And then this sort of envelope around it is sort of like a on-off.
Right. So
like,
you
okay,
can have
that gene's just not going to work anymore. And, you know, could be that gene maybe needs to work.
Exactly.
Right.
So, you know, turning off or on a gene can be as, you know, significant as, you know, changing the makeup of the gene.
Yeah, exactly. Because if the gene's there and it's not working, you might as well just get rid of that portion of your DNA.
So, you know, what you said earlier was a key point, you know, as far as, all right, you know, you do this, you know, you make these alterations, but you're not looking to the future to see what long-term effects this is having. You know, what we know is that we live in an ecosystem, you know, that there's an interdependency on most things that are in that ecosystem.
All life is interdependent. Exactly.
So if we try to micromanage by doing these things and think it's not going to have a overall effect on, you know, other species or other plants or the interaction of these things, I think we're kind of deluding ourselves.
Well, and to me, it's almost, how could you not think that? I mean, if you alter the source, you're altering what's going to follow.
Right. And most of the time, and most of the studies, when we look at, public perception.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I don't think people are necessarily even aware.
Well, number one, there's certainly the awareness is not there to the extent that this is already in the food supply.
Right. People are like, I can go to Whole Foods.
Yep.
And if it's labeled organic, no GMO, I'm safe.
Yep.
Right?
And, what we know is that there are certain companies that are really doing due diligence. Mm-hmm. There are companies that, are doing their best efforts to not include any GMO, in their
production
products.
Of their food,
right.
Or even
and
direct food.
There, you can go on the internet, you can look at the list on our website. We have them, and for the most part, there are now movements to try to have companies that would verify, like we have organic verification. Mm-hmm. They have companies that are now enlisting in a process to verify that their production meets certain standards for genetically free, foods.
And of course, as we all are aware, depending upon the stringency of those standards, you have
right.
either exposure or no exposure, or the most limited amount of exposure.
But, for the most part, I think people are unaware. Like when we take the two major crops, when we talk about genetic modification, that is probably most pervasive, we're talking corn and soy.
Which is everywhere in our foods.
So, I know you're a foodie and you like to, research this stuff. So, that corn is in everything.
It's in everything. It's even in medicines.
Yeah, right. So, if you, have the, and they're saying that, probably 60 to 70% of the corn grown in the United States is modified genetically. Wow. So when you think of that amount, you think, all right, if I'm buying corn chips.
And they're cheap.
No, not necessarily even they're cheap.
They're expensive.
Chances are I'm eating this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so the probability that, most people, if they're not doing like significant due diligence,
spending 2 hours at the food store,
right? Or going online saying, does
certain brands
have any concern about this GMO issue? Chances are that they're ingesting these genetically modified products. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty pervasive. So we know that corn and soy are in a slew of things.
And really frightening is that soy, in particular, is used a lot in infant formula.
Right. So, we're starting not only to see it in a broad spectrum, but we're also giving it to the most vulnerable.
Right.
So, the pervasiveness is something that people need to be aware of, number one. And we need to remember that when you genetically modify something, it's not something that you just can take away. Once it's introduced into the, the biosphere, it's like, no, let's erase this and go back
because they
to
make
the beginning.
Seeds, then their seeds have that same
right.
genetic
And they're saying
makeup.
that, any, fields that are in the vicinity of, some of these pollen gets dispersed.
Because Mother Nature's still going to do her thing.
Sure.
Right.
So, it's a very difficult thing to control.
Right.
And so, we know it's out there. And what, we question, because this is such a huge, experiment, is what is it doing to us?
Yes, and that's where you see a lot of side effects of this
so a few things,
invasive
clinically in practice, that, is just kind of interesting. And, the connection is always, you're trying to make the connection. As naturopaths, we, kind of pride ourselves into trying to find the cause.
Yeah, and you know what? And I wanted to do this before the show started, and I forgot. And so can I just digress? Because
sure.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but naturopathic doctors are different in their approach to wellness or treating an illness, in that they're not just treating a symptom, although I'm sure you do treat someone's symptoms to alleviate their discomfort and suffering, but ultimately you're trying to figure out why is this person suffering from this. So you are more like detectives.
Sure. Part of what, any physician should do, natural or otherwise, should be getting to the cause. The problem is that, you go to your general practitioner, they have 2 minutes to spend with you.
Yeah, I know.
And so, what their job
What's
is
your
to
trouble
do,
here?
Yeah, right. I mean, the quickest thing is to say,
Write
okay,
a
here,
prescription.
this is what you got. So, I mean, in the process of, listening and paying attention to people and trying to get the history to the point where you can say, well, this all started, when? And what was going on in your life then? And was there any significant change? Basically trying to, think with them about, what possibly could be the connection for you. Mm-hmm. So, leaving no stone unturned in the sense that, we ask them about their emotional stuff. We ask them about, dietary stuff. Are there significant changes that, have, a factor in what you're going through?
Right.
So in this process, naturopaths, kind of are trained to, number one, listen, spend the time, get to the cause, and do the least invasive thing possible to elicit the natural healing processes of the body. Not take over function, but to try to, support.
A little help.
Yeah, give it like a little boost. So, I mean, in the process of, kind of doing all that, we try to, kind of rely on, the natural approaches to healing. Good, clean food, lifestyle changes, stress reduction, all those type of things. But, it gets progressively more difficult when the navigation of just the basics, food, water, exercise, air, is getting so difficult to maneuver with.
And you might not even know what you're dealing with.
Exactly. So, I mean, number one, the issues with, the genetic modification are multitude. It's not only that we've, in a sense, the government has allowed this to take place.
Yes, it has.
Without due research.
Mm-hmm. Or responsibility. Mm-hmm.
There's no requirement for labeling in the United States at all.
Right.
So these companies have no responsibility to let you know that this product contains genetically modified stuff. So that if you have a health issue, you can say, maybe this all started when I started really,
eating those corn chips at night.
Right.
Yeah.
So, when you try to factor in and determine the cause, if you're prevented from significant information that's going to help you think about your own health, what good is it?
Well, yeah, you're shooting in the dark there when you're trying to come up with some sort of causation.
Sure. So, things that have been seen in some of the animal studies, that have been fed the genetically modified, foods, has been interesting. A lot of these studies haven't been done long term, and then we're talking like 90-day studies.
Well, yeah, because you typically write rats.
Right. So most all studies have shown an increase in intestinal inflammation.
And aren't we seeing that, Dr. Kane, in
the
population?
I mean, so, the number of people I see with irritable bowel syndrome or, Crohn's, colitis, any of those inflammatory bowel issues has increased tremendously. So what we know is that the cells lining the gut have, created some type of response to this, genetically modified food. And
they're probably like working overtime trying to deal with it, and then they get inflamed.
Right. So what we know is that when we genetically alter something, the proteins can change. And what our immune system, over its course of, coming to understand what's the enemy,
right,
and what's the nutrients and the friends.
Those are proteins, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So
proteins aren't just our muscles.
No.
Proteins do a lot more in our bodies than just build muscle and tissue.
So if through our, development, the immune system learns that, that protein's good for me, don't attack it because it's going to be something that I can use.
I can use that, right.
So let's just say all of a sudden we take a protein and alter it. The immune system is like,
what the heck is this?
This is a different kind of protein. I'm calling out the guns and going after this
really,
guy.
call the police because there's an intruder in my...
So exactly, that's what happened.
Yeah.
So the immune system, in its kind of looking for the unknown enemy, is doing its job to protect you.
And the immune system, those little policemen,
Yep.
are those called cytokines, or what are those called?
So the initial scouts of the immune system would be like the macrophages. They're like the little
the big
guys.
gobblers.
Yes,
Yep,
yes.
yep.
And then the cytokines would be the mediators that some of these cells would kind of send to call in the troops that would kind of go after things.
Oh, okay.
So
So they're kind of like messengers?
They're like, yes, messengers. And some of them can increase inflammatory pathways
So in
the
other
body.
words, your body's making these cytokines, which are proteins,
Yeah.
and they're going to make more the more that
They're exposed to these things.
The unknown marauder in your system, and if you have too many of those cytokines, you're getting inflammation.
So, I mean, when we look at people who have chronic inflammatory issues,
And it's not just in the gut, is it, Dr. Kane?
No.
Because maybe you could discuss that too. It could be arthritis.
Sure.
Or
Any of the arthritic conditions. So we're talking, osteoarthritis, any of those things. A lot of the so-called autoimmune diseases, where your body is attacking joints and joint spaces and things like that, can be fit into this category of dysregulation. So when we talk about this alteration of protein, we know that protein alteration in the body can cause this immune cascade of events that can lead to intestinal issues, can lead to systemic inflammatory issues. So any of the itises, when we say...
And there's a ton of them out
yeah,
there.
they are. There are a lot.
Now, what about a link with cancer?
So that's also the question, but the combination of some of these genetically modified things with the use of the herbicides, pesticides.
Oh, yeah, so you're getting one bad thing after the next.
Right. So your gut is inflamed, and what happens is when the gut gets inflamed chronically, there's a situation that happens where the barriers between the cells don't keep things out. So a lot of people develop...
Yeah, because it's like open now and oozy, raw.
Right. It's
right?
like,
yeah.
like
if you had a blister in there.
Right.
I mean, and stuff's no
so
barrier.
that barrier is now compromised. So there's this syndrome called leaky gut.
Leaky gut syndrome.
Right.
Yeah.
And what
happens with leaky gut?
So with leaky gut, it's, in the same kind of pathway as the inflammation, is that we know that when we have inflammation in the gut, the junction, the cell walls, which are like the barrier, like the Berlin Wall for the gut, it's like that starts to get holes in it. So what ends up happening is things that shouldn't get through are getting through.
So all this stuff that's in your gut, and imagine, we know what's in our gut. I mean, it's food and waste.
Right.
And so, and it's kept in there because of our tissue, and it's all nice and tight, and it does its job. So now it's leaking, and we're getting all that stuff in our bloodstream.
So, you know, the evolution of our gut was meant to be a selective barrier, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, we need that vitamin C. Let's take that.
Oh, okay.
You know, we need
it's not
this.
just about leaking out. The gut is actually even drawing things out of because the digestion just doesn't all occur in your stomach.
No. So as it goes
gut.
through the small intestine, the large intestine, you know, there's different places where, you know, you absorb different
nutrients.
Things. Exactly. Nutrients, you know, break down the proteins into amino acids and all that. When that happens correctly, you know, it's almost like this selective membrane where you're, you know, picking out, you know, things that, you know, your body needs. That
almost like
day.
a little assembly line too. It's like here, it's going to pick out that, and then down the road, it's going to do more and more and more.
So in the process of this kind of disruption or inflammation, that really gets
kind of goes haywire.
Yeah.
And, you know, you got to wonder, like, what, geez, I mean, here people are eating food and they're not getting nutritionally supported from the foods they're eating.
So, yeah, I mean, so it's not unusual to see, you know, a significant amount of nutritional deficiencies because of that, you know, selective processes.
And you know, when people are nutritionally deficient, they tend to eat more, don't they?
Sure.
Because you're like, I feel weak, you know, so you eat
and the
and
cycle
then you're gaining
continues.
weight and you're, exactly.
So, I mean, so some things clinically that, you know, we see a lot more of that's just puzzling is this, you know, the intestinal inflammatory issues, this burgeoning of gluten sensitivity.
Exactly.
Like, when I was a kid...
I never heard of it.
No. Like, you went to school, nobody and their brother had anything related to gluten sensitivity. You know,
heck, they didn't even, what the heck was gluten? Because now they're dumping gluten too, aren't they not cleaning the processed foods? You know,
sure, they use it as a binder or as a thickener.
Yeah. So you're just getting overloaded with gluten.
Exactly.
And it might even be bad gluten.
So, I mean, the issue with, you know, gluten is interesting because I don't know if you read that book, Wheat Belly. Mm-hmm. The physician who wrote that book was very interesting in talking about that wheat today is very different from the wheat that our parents used to eat.
And has wheat been genetically modified?
No, not technically. It's been hybridized.
Which is the same thing.
It's a genetic change.
Manipulation.
But when we talk about genetic manipulation, we're talking interspecies, like taking, you know, maybe a gene from tomatoes and putting it in a wheat or something. Mm-hmm. But with the wheat, they're using wheat to cross with other wheat strains, but it's wheat that probably would have never been in contact with each other. Like, it wouldn't have happened naturally in that way. Mm-hmm. So in that process of hybridizing, we've changed the protein composition to include a lot more of these gluten proteins. Mm-hmm. And the impact it has not only on, you know, kind of our ability to digest, but some of those compounds act like opiates in the brain, making you desire more of them.
Well, if I can just give a short experience, because I'm telling you, this is so true. I used to be a real bread addict.
Yep.
No, I would.
It's easy to be one.
Bread.
Yeah.
And you know, I would go to Bliss Market and get the nice bread they had there, but and I just couldn't stop eating it. And I was really over time developed pain.
Sure.
In my right here.
Yep.
Kind of like descending area.
Yep.
And I sort of made the connection. Gee, maybe it's all that bread I'm eating.
Sure.
So I stopped eating bread a lot, and eventually
it got better.
The pain went away, but it was very difficult to not eat that bread.
Sure.
I mean, it was like
a drug.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's
like an addict. I was like a bread addict.
So, I mean, they've really
I didn't know that acted as opiates.
Yeah.
I feel so bad now. I thought I had bad willpower.
No, you didn't know you're being drugged.
I was, woo.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of those things that when we see, when we understand the reasoning behind it, it makes it, so much knowing that, we weren't weak, we were being drugged,
Right. It's not, you don't have you're not a weak person. You were, right.
So what's the interesting with the wheat and the gluten and celiac kind of issue is that what we're finding is that what used to be a very narrow kind of definition where, like
you could eliminate wheat.
No, the diagnosis for celiac disease, for example, used to be very kind of specific.
Oh, so in other words, an individual might, in their genetic makeup, lack the ability to break down gluten.
Right. But it's changed so that we're now seeing like the spectrum of gluten sensitivity.
Oh,
where
everybody, just about, or a lot more people.
Like, I've been to so many restaurants where they have a gluten-free menu. You're like, wow, it's affecting a significant amount of population when restaurants are going out of their way to kind of offer that.
Right.
So what we know is that the spectrum of expression is not only related to what's happening in our gut, but people are seeing, issues with focus and attention. They're seeing issues with, joints and joint pains.
And what about depression?
Well, because of that whole opiate effect, we're seeing, some of the issues related to some of the neurotransmitters in the brain. So, that role, the role of, modifying food in general, has these systemic things that, and influences that nobody's really delving into.
And I find that so aggravating because truly, isn't that science, Dr. Kane? You observe an effect.
Right.
And you should be trying to, you see things that have been added to that system and work back from there.
Yep.
So it's almost like it's so obvious, but yet because we haven't had the scientific laboratory proof, they're saying there's no scientific correlation when, the whole lab is the population.
Yep. And what is interesting is, I was talking about these, animal studies that were, 90 days. And it's clear from looking at them that there were significant differences between the animals fed the genetically modified versus the non-genetically modified foods. The differences.
So these results were sort of ignored or lied about? Or?
They were brushed off as not biologically significant. And just the fact that there were differences is enough to make you say, well, maybe we shouldn't go ahead with this until we know what the long-term effects are.
Right.
That didn't happen. So what's crazy, in my mind, is that when you see a biological evident difference and do nothing, that's criminal.
Yes, I agree with you.
So the animal studies clearly showed that there were differences in intestinal tract problems. There were differences in liver, kidney, and the spleen.
So that's pretty much our major organs.
Right.
Besides our heart, but you got to figure those other, the kidney's going to affect the heart. I mean, it's.
And then there was that French study that I don't know if you
recently
came
this
out.
past like late summer, wasn't it? Or
yes. Where it showed tumors developing in the animals that were fed to genetically modified foods.
And now and wasn't there a study too that was finding some of these toxins in breast milk?
Yes. So when we look at, the effects not only of, the genes getting into our system, we also look about, the herbicides and the pesticides that are used. There's, significant evidence that they're in all of us. I don't know if you're familiar with the Environmental Working Group. They have a website and they've done some interesting work. They've done this study where they looked at testing the umbilical cord blood of mothers who had just given birth. And this was across the United States in the economic spectrum. And when they did analysis looking for residue of different chemicals, they found the lowest number in these samples was over 200. So 200 potentially, toxic chemicals was found in the blood that was...
So 200 different chemicals
was in the blood that was supposed to be, nourishing a fetus, which is in its most kind of...
That's when all your DNA is being formed.
So it's in its most vulnerable part of its life where it's developing everything. So what's crazy is that when we think about the role that government plays in, protecting us, it's really clear that they're not really
protecting us.
No. And the lobby for the biotech industries, the chemical industries, where they're making these huge donations to these politicians and basically buying their compliance.
Exactly.
Is ridiculous.
And actually, just recently, with all the sequestering and a bill just passed the House and Senate.
Explain this one. Yeah, this is
they embedded this.
They dubbed it the Monsanto Protection Clause.
Protection Clause, which means that essentially Monsanto can do anything it wants to do, and the government can never take any action against them. So essentially, it was almost like Monsanto can rob the banks. Imagine committing a crime. So essentially, I think what the government has just said that we're just not going to view that as a crime against humanity.
Right.
Yeah. And it was they slid that in. I found it was interesting too because it was Barbara Mikulski of Maryland who was on that
she's
committee,
the one that introduced
and she's the one that slid it in. And I'm from Maryland, and
are you?
Yeah, and it's sad because Barbara Mikulski used to have more integrity. She's been in Congress a long time. She was first in the House and the Senate. But Maryland grows a lot of corn, the Eastern Shore.
Yeah.
So you got to think that somebody got something there. And then some speculation, of course. But but that's once again how our legislative process is,
right,
and how things come to be. And a lot of it is because, we just don't know what's going on behind our backs. And we assume, everybody's, they too much government and telling us what to do and this and that. But, government is there to protect us, not just from, foreign invaders.
Right.
And, we're facing a foreign invader made in the USA.
Yeah, and it's,
And other countries are taking, they don't want this stuff. They're taking action to block these substances into their country. So, as Americans, we have to wonder why,
You're not just crazy Europeans.
Yeah, this isn't just like about freedom fries and French fries. This is like,
serious
they're
stuff.
Very concerned because, the United States is the breadbasket of the world. I mean, we supply a lot of food throughout the world, and our seed stock goes to help farmers in other countries plant their crops. So it's a real problem for the world, not just here in the United States. And so I think, it's so invasive because, just as you said, corn, soy, it's in everything. Right. And so I guess what, we would really want our viewers to be aware of is the need for them to really check their labels.
Sure. I mean,
and just avoid certain foods. I mean, if it's in a box or a can, maybe you just shouldn't be eating it in the first place. It's really...
No, you're right. I mean, I think the thing
or a
that...
bag.
Certainly the thing that proactively, people can do is certainly investigate, this verified non-GMO kind of website, look at the companies that are doing a good due diligence. I'll do a lot of my, shopping at a local farmer's market where I can talk to the farmer and say, listen, these are my concerns. Do you do any of these things? Mm-hmm. look at them in the eye, saying, all right, you're the one growing this stuff. So I found sources that, I feel I can do, the best diligence, to figure out what is going on. There are some interesting things. Like I found this bakery in Amherst, Mass. that has contracted with local farmers to grow the old heritage wheat, which has not been hybridized. They are using that in all their baked goods. Oh. They're also having people, if they wanted to buy a community-supported thing, buy a share, and they'll mill the flour for you so you can use that.
So you can use their wheat, right? Yeah.
So it's like, the old thing of, producing locally, supporting your local farmers, and, getting in, having a connection to your food rather than, just going to these, kind of huge places and,
and just grabbing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, getting your kids involved in a backyard garden, Those type of things are, certainly where you have a role to play in, nourishing your body and yourself.
Well, I was talking to someone about this topic too, and it was like, what can we do? And, we're kind of, and really, it's not, we can't rely on our government to do what's right, obviously.
No, obviously,
but they haven't. And just recently they haven't, as of a couple of days ago. So, but I think, like you were saying, more restaurants have gluten-free menus, more, I know Whole Foods has taken a promise to eliminate all GMOs by
2018.
2018.
Yeah.
And now, the fact that it's going to take them till 2018 to do that,
it's not.
It's a big
quick fix. Yeah.
Because people, so it does have to come from our behaviors as consumers. If we stop buying those products, then they'll stop.
Yep. I mean, there's a movie on the web called Genetic Roulette that talks about, the implications that kind of has some of the scientists that used to work for Monsanto and some of these other companies and said, we did the studies, they didn't
pass them on to the authorities.
So,
exactly.
Those issues certainly are kind of like, it's
really mind-blowing.
No, I mean, every time.
It's mind-blowing because it's really, if you or I, as normal, everyday citizens, did something like that,
we'd be in jail.
And
it is true. I mean, every time I read the depth of some of these
deception,
I get
you just want to,
No, you get angry.
Yeah, of course
you have this visceral thing like, how could somebody do this? And so, that whole kind of issue is one thing. And then, like we talked about, the ability to know, just to know,
And that's with the labeling.
Yes.
Yes. And before we go on to that, I think it's important too, because we were discussing earlier that it's these genetically modified foods and then the substances that they make from these foods are not just in food. They're in medicine.
Right. So different.
They're in vitamins.
Yes.
Supplements, things that we take because we're trying to do what's for ourselves and be healthy, and they're even in that.
Yes.
Right.
So.
So if you're like not feeling good and you don't know why, you're taking care of yourself. I mean, sometimes we know why we're not feeling good, and we know. But there's times, and you meet people, they just don't feel well, or they can't get rid of an ailment. Maybe you need to go a little deeper into why this might be so.
If we have time, there's a perfect case that would kind of
go ahead.
Demonstrate this. There's a patient I saw. She came to me. She had been dealing with, chronic joint issues. She was diagnosed with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia.
And people probably thought she was crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in her talking to her, I said, have you ever kind of tried just eliminating all the grains from your diet? Because the grains certainly are the ones that have been messed with the most. I said, what do you got to lose? Why don't you take the next 2 months and just, eat a grain-free kind of diet. She came back and was symptom-free.
Unbelievable.
She didn't have any of her arthritic pain. She was like, I'm working out more because I feel good.
Right.
She lost like 20 pounds.
Exactly.
And I said, great. And she said, I could eat like this for the rest of my life because I feel so good.
And you should.
And so, she did that. And we talked some about the possibility of, the effects of genetic, modification. So she did some research and she found, some things that she wanted to test. And so she brought back in, like, she did, like, spelt,
Okay.
which is an ancient wheat kind of grain, and was fine. She found some other sources of, non-genetically modified things and brought some of these things back in so she wasn't feeling like totally...
Well, you do want to have that piece of bread.
Right. So she wasn't...
Opiate-free bread.
So she wasn't completely, kind of deprived, and she was fine. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and, it was clear that, going on that traditional medical route, her next step was to be put on, methotrexate.
Which is a cancer drug.
Right.
Right.
Which is an immune suppressing.
And probably even prednisone for the inflammation. It's like you give the bad one and the good one. And
so, I mean, obviously not the solution to the problem.
No.
But, luckily...
And also, too, the animals we consume are eating
this stuff.
These things, because I know with there was a lot of people who are trying to avoid eating a lot of meat. They might eat some more eggs.
Sure.
And the chickens are fed soy.
Right.
So you're getting that
whole introduction in those ways.
In those ways too. So it's not it's the whole food chain.
Right.
And because these things have been introduced at pretty much at the basic level of the food chain, it's everywhere.
Correct.
It's everywhere.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, there is a bill coming up in Connecticut.
Yep.
So that the citizens of Connecticut will have a right to know what's in their food. And it's called House Bill 6519.
Yep. So this would be the first labeling requirement in the United States. So
it's the first in the United States?
Yes.
The citizens of Connecticut are spearheading a movement here?
Yeah.
This is historic for us.
Yeah. So it could be huge.
It could be very huge.
And so what this bill would require require clear labeling of any foods that contain any genetically modified, organisms. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's just the right to know, basically. So when we look at, making decisions about our own health, we don't have to be Sherlock Holmes. We don't have to do so much work to figure out, oh, yeah. And
exactly, because, and if it's not labeled at all, how are you going to know?
And, when people are asked, that simple question of, if you had a choice between, eating something that was genetically modified and not, the majority of people say, no, I wouldn't want to eat it.
Yeah, well, I think people are sort of wary of it. Yeah, I mean, it's...
So, I think, these companies know that. So they're fighting tooth and nail because they know once one state...
Well, it's just like we saw today.
Right.
With Prop 8 voted down in California, and we're going to see, hopefully, a federal legislation.
Yep.
Honoring people's civil rights. So, no, the states, it does come from, a lot of the legislation does come from the states. And I did not know that Connecticut this would be the first state.
Yeah,
California. That's unbelievable.
California had it on their books.
Oh, and they got voted down.
But, Monsanto put millions of dollars in advertisement confusing the whole issue.
They'll be really crafty about how they can dissuade, and and then there's, and it is just really up to the citizenry to
So we
use our intellect. So
we have a chance to make history.
we do, and this Thursday, March 28th.
Yep. There's a rally
at Real Artways in Hartford, 56 Arbor Street. There's kind of like people getting together to talk about really trying to get this House bill through.
Yep.
And it's from 7 to 8:30. So if you want to be part of that movement, and if you can't make that meeting, there's it's the Food and Water Watch group in Connecticut, and I have to tell you, they're very nice people. I've been on the phone with them a couple of times, and they're very diligent too. I mean, they've called me several times to get me out to a meeting, so I told them I'll be there on Thursday. But the number for that group is 973-738-0738. The woman's name is Lucy Sedgwick. So if you want to get involved with that, once again, it's 973-738-0738. But for people who want to maybe, take matters into their own hands, you have a website, Dr. Kane, that has a lot of the food manufacturers that are diligent about GMOs.
And that website is yournaturalhealth.com. Again, that's yournaturalhealth.com. And we also have a Facebook page that we post on. You could just search for Connecticut Center for Health, and I post there all the time.
Well, didn't Hippocrates say, let food be your medicine?
Yes.
Yes. And it's kind of like, and as a naturopath, I'm sure you feel that way, that food is absolutely our medicine. And, we're losing the ability to have that happen, and it's almost like our food is now turning into our poison.
Well, yeah, it's like that contamination.
Right. And
it's like using something that has the ability to heal and taking that ability away.
Taking it back. And I think, for a lot of people, they hear this GMO and, health food, and it's like this hippy-dippy thing, and who can afford to eat that way. None of us can afford not to eat that way, right, Dr. Kane?
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. Just in that one case, it made a huge difference.
It makes a huge difference, and so it was very nice to talk to you tonight about
as always,
this. And,
great to be here.
I think
time flies, doesn't it?
It certainly does, especially I think it's such the basis of we can't live without food.
No.
And healthy food.
Yeah.
And that ability to even know which foods are healthy is our right to know.
Sure.
And we can take steps to secure that right to know. And though there's forces that are working against our right to know. And
it's just we got to be stronger than that.
And so I would urge you at least to call your state representatives and ask them to vote for House Bill 6519, and just keep calling, writing, calling, and get involved with the actions. So hopefully I'll see you Thursday night.
Yeah, I'm planning on it.
Oh, great. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Good
coming
to see
again.
you.
It's good to see you too.
You too.
Good night, everyone, and call your congresspeople. That was good, huh?
So quick.
I know.